Welcome back to Afternoon Garage. Well, if you watched last week, you know exactly how I came in possession of this Firebird. So this week, I'm going to talk about exactly what I did to make the whole car happen. But first, I want to go over, maybe just skim briefly, the different generations of Firebirds, kind of what they look like, what years they were made, and what makes this one special. Then I'm going to get into the drivetrain. Explain exactly how I made the choice of the drivetrain I did, and how I made it happen, and roadblocks that I encountered to actually getting the thing completed and on the road. It was a struggle, but you'll have to watch the entire episode to find out how this one turns out. So first off, we're going to talk about the first generation Firebird. That was from 1967, 68, and 69. It really didn't change a whole lot. They look considerably different. That's considered the first generation Firebird. This here is the second generation Firebird. Firebirds and Camaros, they all use the same unibody chassis. They kind of went to a subframe up front, which is removable. I think the thought there was you do engine and transmission swaps kind of easy, but it really didn't work out that way. The second generation Firebird, as you see here, went from 1970 to 1981. In 77, when it came along with the Bandit style Trans Am, that's really the one everybody kind of identifies with. You know, they think about a certain actor out there who may have played in a movie, running away from police officers.
We've got a long way to go and a short time to get there.
And that really kind of boosted the notoriety of the Firebird. 1982 was a new model year for the car, and that's when we kind of get that 80s styling that really isn't that popular nowadays. But they're kind of coming up in value a little bit. I think that people can identify with that. They had something like that when they were a kid or something like that. This is where I first became interested in Pontiac Firebirds. In fact, I had a Pontiac Firebird We Build Excitement poster on my wall. I was destined to have a Firebird. So after the third generation Firebird, you get into the fourth generation Firebird. That was the last Firebird that they ever did. They really kind of got some cool styling there in the end. It was more of a complete unibody car. Now, when the fourth generation Firebird came out, that went from 93 to 2002. Now, in 2002, they had the WS6 option on the Trans Am. I thought that was a really good looking car. I was really curious to see where they were going to go with that. Unfortunately, they got rid of the Camaro and the Firebird after the 2002 model year. Didn't bring the Camaro back until 2010. They offered 4 engines for this car, 3 V8s and a 6-cylinder. The first engine they offered was a inline 6-cylinder, made about 100 horsepower. Boy, that would be pretty sluggish on a car as heavy as this. The second engine they offered was, I believe what this car had, it was an L30. That produces 155 horsepower. That's a 350 V8. The next engine they offered was the 400. The 400 was a big block engine. That was considerably more horsepower than any of them. That was 185 horsepower. However, you're carrying around all that weight of the big block, so probably kind of evened out. And the next engine they had was the L75. Now that was what they call the HO 455. Once again, they didn't offer Super Duty. If it was a Super Duty, it'd be around 230 horsepower. The horsepower rating on the big block 455 was only 200. So for the 1975 model year, a few things changed. This was the first year of the curved rear glass. The first 4 years of the Firebird really had a big blind spot in there, so adding the curvature in the window enabled the driver to actually see when they're changing lanes. Another thing that they added was radial tuned suspension. Whatever the heck that means. Maybe they put sway bars in there. I don't know. I'm not quite sure. Another thing that the 1975 model year cars had was the addition of catalytic converters. This put a really kind of a strange hump in the floor, and it also stopped them from using anything bigger than a turbo hydromatic 350 transmission. So even if you had the big block engine, you're never going to have any bigger of a transmission than a 350 in a 1975 model year Firebird. That's the way it was. They said, turbo hydromatic 350 should be able to handle the power of the big block, which we know is 200 horsepower. They were right. So here's the 350 engine the previous owner had planned on using. Now, there's nothing really special about it. I guess this thing was rebuilt. He had intended on putting it in the car, and obviously you can see I didn't do that. It's really nothing special about it. You can see it's an overhead valve pushrod motor. I believe that the Pontiacs now had just a little bit higher lift of a cam than the Chevrolets did. Therefore, they produced just a little bit more horsepower, and I think that's why the slogan came along, "We build excitement." Well, it was exciting, but I don't know how exciting 155 horsepower would be out of this thing. But what he did do is the guy actually had planned on putting the engine in it of the same year that came out of it, but it's stamped 1975 on the back, so I know he got an engine that's supposed to fit in this car at some point or another, even though this isn't the actual engine that came out of it. So really, when I went and started work on this car, I had pretty good intentions of, you know, taking that engine, putting it back together, adding a few more parts, and kind of making it black like it was, and, you know, just maybe putting it together and flipping it. But as time went on, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I think this thing needs a swap of some kind. So, I contacted a wrecker out of Reno, Nevada. 2 weeks later, freight truck arrived with a 6-speed and an LS3. This came out of a late model Camaro with pretty low miles in it. I was pretty happy to get the whole engine and transmission for under $9,000. Doesn't seem very cheap, does it? Well, after you're done shipping something like that, you know, this project snowballed into something I never really expected. That's what happens with car projects. And this one is no exception. So I was really excited when I was taking the engine out of the crate. They packed it up really well, and it included everything. It included the headers and the intake manifold, all the accessories, most of the wiring harness, a computer. These wrecking yards that sell these things, they really know what people really need to have to make a swap happen. And they did me right. So after making the decision to throw the 350 aside and put the LS in it, I decided to make it easier for myself and purchase some engine mounts. So I contacted a company online that sells engine mounts. They were kind of expensive. They were $500, $600, something like that. It included the 2 front engine mounts and the rear cross member, but they were all spec. They were all where they were supposed to be. Supposedly it's for a 1970 to 1981 F-body, which this is. So I purchased it to make my job a lot easier. Save some time. This engine mount kit, while being very expensive, I figured, well, you know, if it'll save me a lot of time and aggravation of building some engine mounts, you know, you're gonna have to weld some 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch thick steel plates together, maybe get a bushing, something like that. I didn't have to come up with any of that stuff. So I was really happy that I was able to order something off the shelf, even though it did put a dent in my wallet. I started by taking the engine hoist and dropping the engine right down onto the subframe. I installed the engine mounts they provided, and I took some quick measurements. The engine was over to the left, nearly 1.5 inches. I know that working on aircraft, the firewalls are kind of mounted in a different way to where the engine actually will respond to the torque and it won't allow the airplane to twist. This is not an airplane. The engine should sit square center, right in the middle of the engine cradle. I contacted and talked to the manufacturer about exactly what might be going wrong with these engine mounts. He suggested to me there's a little bit of adjustability in there, kind of move them around a little bit, but actually from comparing one side to the other, the catalytic converters on one side were hitting the frame, and on the other side, I had a good 1.5 to 2 inches of clearance. That was my first dead giveaway that something was incorrect. The suggestions are usually out on the web. Yeah, that's kind of how they are. You can remove the stock manifolds and install stainless steel tube headers, which I probably was going to do anyway, but that still doesn't explain why the engine was mounted over 1.5 inches. Shouldn't be happening since I paid $600 for an engine mount kit that was supposed to fit this application. Shorten up this story a little bit. I ended up sending those back. I had to take a $150 hit on shipping, but it didn't really matter because they weren't going to work for me anyway, and I ended up getting a kit where I could make my own. My engine mounts look like this. You can see one engine mount is definitely a lot bigger than the other. This was needed to provide correct mounting locations within the engine compartment. Let's take a look at that. This is actually an LS3 and not an L99. Now, the difference between the LS3 and the L99 is the LS3 is made for the manual transmission. L99 is not and has displacement on demand, has the factory air conditioning plenum, which is a really good thing. I didn't have to add that at all. I did have to put a different receiver dryer in there, but hey, that's okay. It looks kind of factory. So a bunch of stuff had to happen in order to get this engine mounted in here. Namely, the air conditioning compressor and the alternator here had to be mounted high up. It's really difficult to have the air conditioning compressor and the alternator down underneath and have everything fit. Now if you're going to use a stock subframe, as I did here, there's not going to be much clearance for you to put your accessories on either side of the motor. Now you can see how tight that is around the top of that oil pan there. So I purchased a kit to move the air conditioning compressor up and another one to move the alternator up. One thing you have to be concerned about, this engine produces 430 horsepower. So your radiator has to be stout enough to be able to cool 430 horsepower. Well, the original brass copper 2-core probably wasn't going to work well. So I had to purchase this with dual electric fans. Now that's an LS3 intake. So all I did was paint it white, mask it off, paint the blue, paint the red, and God bless America. So there's a few more things going on underneath that I'd like to show you. Things you're going to have to do if you want to do this yourself. So let's make it go up and look underneath. This has a TR6060 manual transmission. It also has a provision for cooling. So I put a heatsink type transmission cooler right underneath the radiator. Another thing that makes these swaps a little challenging is knowing what oil pan to use. This oil pan should not be lower than this crossmember. If it is, you're going to have problems. Here's a side view of the oil pan and the crossmember. You can see they're pretty much flush with each other. When I first attempted to drop the motor in, I used an oil pan off another GM product. I believe it was a Hummer H3 oil pan. This oil pan extended down 2 inches past the crossmember. Way too low. However, it was told to me that's the oil pan typically people use. So I got the engine halfway in, and you can see how deep this oil pan is. So I had to take the oil pan off and put a different one on. The one I put on here was this one here. This is a welded oil pan. I really don't like using stuff like this. It doesn't look factory, and sometimes these welded oil pans are prone to leaks. You can see this one here has a little damage in it. I haven't even driven this car anywhere, and yet it's got a little dent in there. One thing about using these fabricated welded pans, there's no provision for an oil filter on the side. So you have to run an external filter. You have to convert these to aircraft fittings and move the filter to another location. The filter location I used was in the front of the motor on the frame rail. Pretty tight clearance with that sway bar in there, but I could use a PH8A oil filter, which has a really high capacity. Another thing you can see here is I went with these 1 3/4 MANDREL bent stainless headers. Now these things, there's not much clearance in between the block, and certainly the frame there. I probably could have used the stock exhaust manifolds off a Camaro. However, the problem is, it leaves the exhaust too low. They offer O2 bungs in the rear. They're really stout. They're really constructed well. I'm happy with them. I kind of have this H-pipe set up. This is to equalize the exhaust pressure. Has kind of a flow-through design. I like this. This becomes prefabricated. As well as I have exhaust cutouts operated by an electronic solenoid. I'll tell you what, when you open these throttle plates open, both of them will open up, this thing gets really loud and it's right underneath you, and I love every bit of it. I have BORLA's Pro XS series mufflers. Did a lot of research on these. These have the most appealing sound I have ever heard. They're nice and quiet. When you get into it, they get a little loud, but I'm really not into the noise. So these are great for me. And while we're still on the subject of the engine, I find it really important. even on a lowered car like this, exhaust tips belong in the rear of the car. On to the TR6060 transmission. The TR6060 is just a copy of the T56 Magnum. It has better internals than the T56, but the only difference is it doesn't have a slip yoke. So I had to use a slip drive shaft instead. We'll get to that in a minute. This has an internal clutch release bearing. So an adapter had to be purchased to use a stock GM master cylinder in this slave application. This part here was almost $50, which leads me to another point. It seemed like, I really wanted to do this inexpensively, get an LS3 that was already running, something that was in another car, just kind of keep the cost down. But it seemed that every time I went to go put one of these parts together and actually hook it up to something else, every time there's a little adapter or a little part or something that I couldn't make myself, then ended up costing $50 to $100. So by the time I got something hooked up I thought was fairly simple, you can add $200 or $300 onto that and you're on your way. Let's continue. Along with that transmission install, you have to make sure and add that third pedal. There are lots of kits for this on the internet. Pick one up, throw it in. Connect a slave cylinder to it and you're done. A little bit of fabrication. The rear of the transmission, you'll see I have this adapter. This adapter is a 3-bolt flange to U-joint adapter. This had to be used because, like I said, there's no built-in slip yoke in this. In fact, the car that this transmission comes out of has a fixed differential in the rear. A slip drive shaft had to be fabricated. There's the slip right there. It's splined. This drive shaft is supposed to be good for 450 horsepower or more. Hooks to a GM 10 volt, 373 gearing, positive traction. And last but not least, you get into the fuel tank. Now the fuel tank, I had to put a high pressure fuel pump in there. Special kit which mounts on the top of the fuel tank. One thing in building this car that I kind of had to figure out on my own was, hey, it smelled like fuel in here almost all the time. I really couldn't figure that out. I thought maybe my fuel pump wasn't sealing correctly. Maybe I had a fuel leak, even worse yet. I didn't really find anything, but what I did find is that the vent was completely open. What that was doing is it was allowing fuel vapors to collect up in there where the fuel tank was underneath the car. Get a good gust of wind blowing in your direction, whew, man, it stinks. So I reached out to the internet, I asked some people, hey, what do you do about that? The response I got was, old cars stink. If you don't like it, go out and buy a new car. That's not the right answer. Here's the vent I was talking about. I had to hook that up to a charcoal can in front of the car. It's funny how easy things can be. You actually just take the time to think about how these things work. The wiring was, well, really wasn't that bad. I mean, the ECU is mounted right here, so everything kind of had to be gathered to the same place. I have my fuse blocks and my fuses and my relays that actually drive and run the engine right here. Fan control relay right here. Everything's really close to the battery. Keeps everything kind of close together and maintained. Makes your wiring job a lot easier. For those of you who build cars or work on cars or fabricate things, you know that electrical is one of the last things that you do. So it's time to reprogram the ECM. This is not the ECM that belongs in this car, however. It's representative of something that you would send in to get reprogrammed. Typically there's a PROM in here with the older generation stuff. The newer stuff, you just program right through the OBD2 port. So I chose somebody on the internet, through eBay, to get my ECM reprogrammed. Now what I wanted to have programmed out of it is typically you send these things in and they'll program a VIN number, match the VIN number to the VIN number of the vehicle so your body control module and everything matches. I didn't need anything like that done. The reason is because the computer came out of the car that the engine was in. Well, what I did need was, I needed the rear oxygen sensors to be ignored and not set codes. I also needed to disable the purge systems, so it wouldn't detect engine vacuum and detect the absence of the purge system. That's really all I needed to have done. And most importantly, I needed to have VATS disabled. VATS, if you don't know, is Vehicle Anti-Theft System. That's a system that GM uses on most of their vehicles nowadays. So I contacted the programmer, told him exactly what I really wanted to do with the ECU. He programmed it and sent it back to me within a week. Plugged it in, no start. Crank, crank, crank. Got on the phone. He said, you know, I did everything that you asked me to do, and it still doesn't work. Really can't help you out. So $150 down the drain. So I had to come up with something else. I then went on to test and troubleshoot the system to see if it was something that I did, because as I said before, 9 times out of 10, it's usually something that you've done that's created a problem. I put a NOID light on the injectors. I didn't see any lights going on, but I did see spark from the spark plugs. So you know you had spark, you know you had good compression, I just didn't have any fuel. So the computer wasn't telling the injectors to fire. That's a typical condition of a vehicle anti-theft failure. I then got online and found a company called HP Tuners. HP Tuners builds programmers who plug into the OBD2 port of most modern cars. You can change all kinds of parameters, fuel maps. It's even got some data logging tools where you can log information over time. And I purchased this. This is an MVPI2. This is HP Tuner's latest programmer. Yeah, this thing's $300. Kind of a drag after I already spent $150 and it's supposed to be working. So what you do is you plug this in here, plug this into the OBD2 port, this plugs into your computer. Let me show you how that works. Here you can see I installed the OBD2 port exactly where it would be on a factory vehicle. Make it easy to find. When you first get HP Tuners, you have two choices. You have the VCM editor and the scanner. So there's two tools here. So we'll open the editor. So how it was when I got this, I opened it up, VATS patch 2 was enabled. Okay, what this does is it actually checks the operation of the starter through the ECU. So if you don't run the starter through the ECU with a separate relay, and you just run it with the key, like you would in 1975, this isn't going to detect that the starter has actually been turned on, and it's not going to allow any fuel to be metered into the cylinders. This was my problem. I had to purchase this $400 piece of software to be able to do this. When I stored it to the ECU, it fired right up. No problem. I know what you're saying. You had to purchase a piece of $300 software to be able to change one parameter? Actually, no. It was even more than that. When you buy HP Tuners, all you're doing is you're buying that MVPI2 module. That's all you're buying. You have to purchase credits depending on what kind of vehicle you're trying to program. The more complex the system is in the vehicle, the more credits you have to purchase. This vehicle required 2 credits. Each credit is $50 a credit. So if you want to program this vehicle, it's going to cost you $100. If you want to program another vehicle with this, it's not going to work on that vehicle because it senses the VIN. I was really happy to get the car running for even $400 because it was the last thing I had to do to get the thing on the road. And that programming service on eBay should have given me a refund. Well, that's about it for now. I'm sure there's more things that I forgot. You know, as time goes on, you kind of forget things. But you know what? I think I covered the main points. Important thing to remember is this kind of stuff isn't cheap, especially when you talk about $9,000 engines and transmissions and that kind of thing. But you know what? I'm going to build reliable horsepower this way. The most important thing to me is to go down the road, not get stranded or have to deal with some issue that maybe you created yourself. Because typically the issues that leave you on the side of the road is something you generally did to yourself. I didn't want any of that. I know there's alternatives to this. People say, why don't you just go get a 5.3 or a 6 liter out of a truck or something like that. If you need more horsepower, put a turbo in it. Well, that just adds to the complexity of what I wanted to do. Anyway, next week, we're going to cover a little bit of the suspension. I'm going to go over the body and the interior as well. And I have a problem. The airbags have failed. And there's a leak in one of the airlines. So I'm going to have to do something to make it more robust because you definitely don't want to have the car lowered onto the ground when you're at a car show or even the store and figure out how to get the car off the ground onto a flatbed. That would be a nightmare. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section. And don't forget to subscribe if you like this content. Stay safe.